We're going to be looking at the chapter on the civil rights movement, and civil rights are the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality. So there's not one particular group of people that this is designed for, but citizens. Citizens are people that have citizenship in the United States under the Constitution. The civil rights movement was a political, legal, and social struggle to gain full citizenship rights for African American. The civil rights movement was first and foremost a challenge to segregation, the system of laws and customs separating African Americans and whites. During the movement, individuals and civil rights organizations challenged segregation and discrimination with a variety of activities, including protest, boycotts, and the refusal to abide by segregation laws. Segregation was an attempt by many white Southerners to separate the races in every aspect of daily life. You can see the pictures as I read. Segregation was often called the Jim Crow system, after a minstrel show character from the 1830s who was an African American slave who embodied negative stereotypes of African Americans. If you look at the second part, one of the cases against segregated rail travel was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, in which the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that separate but equal accommodations was fine. Okay. Eventually, we're going to decide that separate but equal by its very nature is not entirely equal. Segregation became common in southern states following the end of the Reconstruction period in 1877. These states began to pass local and state laws that specified certain types for whites only and others for colored. Again, see the pictures. Court challenges begin. So they were very smart at this time period and decided to fight things through the courts and to take the law as the law for what it says and not to be able to interpret, as President Clinton said, what is. African Americans had separate schools, transportations, restaurants, and parks, many of which were poorly funded and inferior to those of whites. Over the next 75 years, Jim Crow signs to separate the races went up in every possible place. And the NAACP started to support court cases to overrun segregation. The voting requirements included the ability to read and write, which most African Americans at the time didn't have because they couldn't get to school because they had to work, which disqualified them. They didn't have access to it. Property ownership, again, most of them were tenant farmers, which means that they farmed on other people's lands, like the serf system in Europe. And of course, paying a poll tax, which now is illegal, to prevent African Americans from voting. So on this slide, you can see many of the different ways that they were using the courts to fight segregation, to gain civil rights. Norris versus Alabama, Morgan versus Virginia, sit-ins, which were quiet and peaceful sit-ins to desegregate restaurants, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which is typically looked at as one of the most successful because it was unconstitutional and overturning the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. And that one is very prominent. And then the Southern Manifesto, the Declaration of Constitutional Principles, known formally as the Southern Manifesto, was a document written in February and March of '56 in the United States Congress in opposition to racial integration of public places. The manifesto was signed by 100 politicians, 99 Southern Democrats. So what you have to understand is that these were the Southern Democrats that were going up against, or that were wanting segregation. Again, the Southern Democrats wanted segregation, not necessarily Northern Democrats, but they would support their groups in Congress and the Senate, and then not the Republicans. So you can see that Congressman drafted a document to counter the landmark Supreme decision ruling about Brown versus Education, which determined that segregation was unconstitutional, which was good. That they were able to occasionally phones ring during recordings. So obviously it would have been good if they just would have allowed the Supreme Court to make their decision, but they were fighting the Supreme Court. The Montgomery bus boycott, which you guys have all heard about because of Rosa Parks, was a woman in Montgomery, Alabama that refused to move to the seats in the bus that were allocated for African America. So they kind of thought they were going to do this, and she was not the first person. You're going to see somebody that did it before her. It's just that Rosa Parks was probably a better poster figure for the movement. And then, of course, we have Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott was successful, and African-American leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, and they elected MLK to lead them. He decided to use the techniques of Gandhi, which, of course, were nonviolent techniques, which had never been used. Normally, as you can see right now in our society, when people throw rocks and light fires, they seem to think that that's the way they get their point across, and maybe they need to listen a little bit more to Martin Luther King and Gandhi. So what we have here is the African American churches were places where African Americans could easily meet to discuss issues. You do need a place to congregate. So they were located in the communities, and the people worked to end segregation. Montgomery showed that nonviolent protests were effective, and the SCLC conference with MLK and Robert Abernathy encouraged voter registration, and MLK was the president of this group. Well, Eisenhower and civil rights. Eisenhower was also a Democrat. He ordered Navy shipyards to be desegregated, but he didn't support Brown versus the Board of Education. So he gave a little, but not a lot, because really there's more people in a school than there are in the Navy. Crisis at Little Rock, Arkansas. The event was covered by the national media, and you can look it up. And the fate of 9 students attempting to integrate the school gripped the nation. And what they went through is more than what most of us go through. It's actually quite shocking. Not all school desegregation was as dramatic as the Little Rock schools. Often schools were desegregated only in theory because racially segregated neighborhoods led to desegregated schools. So just a thought, just so you guys understand, here in Las Vegas, it was pretty segregated. They called this, a pretty racist place. Another phone call. I think I was here telling you a story about when I was a kid. Schools were desegregated, but unfortunately kids from African American neighborhoods were bused into schools in different neighborhoods, and they could be on the bus for quite some time. So during 6th grade, I was sent to schools that were in predominantly African American neighborhoods. They were called 6th grade centers. Obviously, this seemed like a busing issue for everybody, and eventually it seemed a little bit depressing for kids that were living in predominantly African American neighborhoods to be on buses for an extreme amount of time. The new civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1957, was passed to protect the rights of African Americans to vote. The Democratic Senator Storm Thurmond of South Carolina, an ardent segregationist, sustained the longest one-person filibuster in history to stop it. Again, the Democratic senator tried to stop this from happening. He wanted segregation. As desegregation continued, the membership of the KKK grew. The KKK used violence or threats against anyone who was suspected in favoring desegregation of African American rights. So they killed you no matter what your color was if you were trying to help African Americans. They also had hatred towards many other groups and didn't limit themselves towards hatred of African Americans. So this is very famous, the sit-ins that begin and the sit-in movement. You can see part of this bar at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. February 1st of 1960, 4 African-American college students from North Carolina A&T University began protesting racial segregation in restaurants by sitting in white-only lunch counters, and all they did was sit there. It was not a new form of protest, but in response to the sit-ins throughout North Carolina, within a few weeks, sit-ins were taking place across the cities in the South. Many restaurants were desegregated in response to sit-ins because, of course, segregation makes no sense. This form of protest demonstrated clearly to African Americans and whites alike that young African Americans were determined to reject segregation. The SNCC, and you can see Ella Baker down there. Ella Baker brought different groups together to coordinate their sit-ins. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leader, believe it or not, Marion Barry, who sadly was later arrested for use of crack cocaine as the mayor of Washington, but he has cleaned up his act, which is good. He learned from his mistakes. It was a grassroots movement of young activists. Baker believed the SNCC civil rights activities should be based in individual African American communities. And the SNCC adopted Baker's approach and focused on making changes in local communities rather than striving for national change, kind of like a small amount at a time. Some people say when you commit a sin, you don't go out that day to commit it. You just make smaller sins that all of a sudden put you in a position to do something bigger. And in this way, she was right. She made these great decisions of smaller bits, and then you take those small things and you put them together, and by then you have a huge amount of change. One of the groups was the Freedom Riders, and after the sit-in movement, some of the SNCC members participated in the 1961 Freedom Rides. And so they organized by corps. The Freedom Riders, both African American and whites, traveled around the South in buses to test the effectiveness of the 1961 Supreme Court decision declaring segregation illegal in bus stations open to interstate travel. So they couldn't do it if you were just traveling within one state, but the minute you crossed state lines in that bus, you had to be desegregated because that's the federal government controlling it. Even members of Southern law enforcement allowed attacks on the Freedom Riders. Angry mobs lit a bus on fire carrying those Freedom Riders, if you can believe it. And I believe there's actually a movie about it. So challenging segregation, we have John F. Kennedy. He is a Northern Democrat. Kennedy was the president elected for 1961. He campaigned on a platform of civil rights, but was initially slow to move on the subject when the first in office. He did appoint Thurgood Marshall, though, and Thurgood Marshall went to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York, and he was African American. The Justice Department takes action. So Robert Kennedy is his brother. He was the head of the Justice Department. He eventually moved to ICC, moved the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate Southern segregation terminals. So see, he kind of went that backdoor route as well. This can be done because the buses cross state lines, like I told you. Thurgood Marshall allowed CORE money from the NAACP fund to bail out the Freedom Riders from jail. There were always, there were all ways which the courts could be used to challenge segregations. Okay, and now we're on to James Meredith. The Freedom Riders were working to desegregate bus terminals, and others were working to desegregate schools. Through the legal decision of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education was given in 1954, Southern schools were not complying with these federal rules, so James Meredith applied to the University of Mississippi, believe it or not. And the governor of Mississippi, another Democrat, declared that the schools would not be integrated. So the governor got involved in the schools business. The blending of races for him, because that is what segregation means. The President Kennedy had to send military troops to protect him so that he can enter class. So you guys can see those pictures over there. Imagine just trying to come into Odyssey one day and you're not allowed, and you need to have military escorts. Violence in Birmingham, Alabama was a hotbed of violence against African Americans, Freedom Riders, and protesters. Protests became Bill Connor responded by allowing clubs and police, so that's the guy in charge, allowed clubs and police dogs to attack the protesters. He was also a man that told the KKK when the Freedom Riders were coming to Birmingham so that the KKK could attack the Freedom Riders. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, we had to have another one because the first one wasn't being complied to over fierce opposition from Southern legislature. Johnson, now because Kennedy was murdered, pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress that prohibited segregation in public accommodations and discrimination in education and employment. It also gave the executive branch of government the power to enforce the Act's provisions, so whatever that Act said. And then there was the March on Washington, which is very famous because you guys can see pictures of it all the time. The national civil rights leaders decided to keep pressure on both Kennedy administration and Congress to pass civil rights legislation. The leaders planned a march on Washington to take place August in '63. The idea was the revival of A. Philip Randolph's planned 1941 march, which had resulted in a commitment to fair employment during World War II. Randolph was present at the march, along with leaders of all of those places. And of course, Martin Luther King delivered a moving address. The audience was more than 200,000 people. His I Have a Dream speech, delivered in front of the giant statue of Abraham Lincoln, became famous for the way in which it expressed the ideas of civil rights movement. After President Kennedy was assassinated in November, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, strongly urged for passage of civil rights, which is amazing. Lyndon Johnson was from Texas, so he technically was a Southern Democrat. So it was amazing that he went against his own party. So civil rights becomes law, supported by the Republicans and the Northern Democrats. JFK was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson became president. He was a Democrat from Texas, but surprisingly supported civil rights. Though the Southern Democrats wanted to filibuster, which means talk to death, the bill into not being passed, the Democrats filibustered for 87 days to stop this bill. 87 days. Think about it, you guys. That's almost 3 months of talking. The bill had already passed in the House and the Senate, and this was the last chance for Democrats to stop this. Finally, the filibuster ended and was passed in July. This gave the federal government the power to rule over state segregation laws, and see those pictures there. So the struggle for voting rights. In 1964, the 24th Amendment passed, ending poll taxes, which again, that's you having to pay a fee in order to vote. And then the Selma March, which there's a movie about. You can see the movie thing to the right. MLK selected on Selma as the next campaign of equality. The city is best known for its 1960s Selma voting rights movement and for the Selma to Montgomery marches, beginning with Bloody Sunday. The march in 1965 ended with 25,000 people entering Montgomery at the end of the last march to press for voting rights. This activism generated national attention to social justice, and that summer the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Congress and authorized federal oversight to enforce the constitutional rights of all citizens. Voting Rights of 1965 allowed the federal examiners to register qualified voters, bypassing local officials who often refused to register African Americans. So as it states, racism did not end because a law was passed. That never actually happens because there's still inbred animosities. In 1965, only 15% of African Americans held professional jobs. Half lived in poverty. Most lived in cities where conditions were bad. And then there is the rise of the single-parent homes in African American communities. Currently, 72% of children being born are out of wedlock, which means from unmarried parents and typically single mothers. Neighborhoods, even outside the South, were not allowing African Americans or Mexican Americans from renting or buying in certain neighborhoods. A famous example of the brewing animosities happened in Los Angeles in the Watts riots on August 11th to the 16th of 1965. A neighborhood in Los Angeles is African American motorist was arrested for drunk driving. A minor roadside argument broke out, and then it escalated into a fight. I don't think any of you guys are really alive for Rodney King. That was so early in the 90s, but that obviously wasn't a minor traffic infraction. It was a full-fledged beating. But one incident blows up into something else was my point. The community reacted in outrage to allegations of police brutality that soon spread, and 6 days of looting and arson followed. Rioters burned entire neighborhoods, killed 34 people, and 900 were injured. Typically, though, they're killing their own, and they're actually ruining their own neighborhoods, which is something that is odd. The Kerner Commission was an 11-member commission that established by President Lincoln to investigate the causes of the 67 race riots in the United States, and it basically said that our nation is moving towards two societies, one white and one black, separate but unequal. It recommended 2 million new jobs, 6 million new units of public housing, but unfortunately the public housing in itself also becomes bad. I'm sure those are greater studies in sociology. And so there became a shift into violent resistance, leaving Martin Luther King behind. People wanted violence rather than peaceful progress. And so we have Black Power, Malcolm X, and the Nation of Islam, who eventually leaves the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam, if you're unfamiliar, you'll see men handing out pamphlets in the middle of the median of your I don't know, Sahara indicator, and they'll have bow ties on. The Black Panthers, and then eventually the assassination of Martin Luther King in the peaceful movement. So Black Power, you see the symbol to the right, believed in Black autonomy with a variety of tendencies such as Black nationalism, Black self-determination, and Black separatism. So it wasn't a group that wanted to be integrated. Such positions caused friction with leaders in the mainstream civil rights movement, and thus the two movements have sometimes been viewed as inherently antagonistic. Civil rights leaders often proposed passive nonviolent tactics, while Black movement felt that nonviolent approach to civil rights was just too slow, taking too long, and wasn't what they wanted. It was a luxury for white people do not deserve. Now, the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X was the son of a Baptist preacher, believe it or not, and then he began to study the teachings of Muhammad while he was in jail. Muhammad taught that white society, Elijah Muhammad, not the Muhammad from the other Muslims, white society actively worked to keep African Americans from empowering themselves and achieving political, economic, and social success. Among other goals, the NOI fought for a state of their own, a separate one that is inhabited by white people. Louis Farrakhan would be the man that you would look to for the Nation of Islam today. At a speaking engagement in Manhattan's Auburn Ballroom on February 21st, 3 gunmen rushed Malcolm on stage. They shot him 15 times. And close range, the 39-year-old was pronounced dead. Now, at that point, he was not a part of the Nation of Islam, but those men were that killed him. Black Panthers in October of 1966, Oakland, California. Huey Newton and Bobby Steele founded the Black Panther Society for Self-Defense. The Panthers practiced militant self-defense of minority communities against the U.S. government, and they protected themselves, too, from each other, and fought to establish revolutionary socialism through mass organization of community-based programs. So remember, socialism is where everything is shared and owned by the government. They urged African Americans to arm themselves and confront white society. The practices of the late Malcolm X were deeply rooted in theoretical foundations of the Black Panther Party. And then, of course, Martin Luther King was assassinated by a sniper's bullet. I still can't believe he was only 39 years old, which I know seems old to you, but since I'm older than you, it doesn't seem that old. So probably two of the biggest faces of the civil rights movement are one that used nonviolent and one that used maybe violent, or at least more towards violent means. And these are their, look at them, Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. And so you can see this, how you can compare and contrast the way these two individuals looked. Martin Luther King was using nonviolent forms. He called weapons of love, and he was assassinated by one bullet at one person, whereas Malcolm X was suspicious of whites and willing to use any means necessary, imprisoned for drug use, which a lot of people are, led to his conversion, though, into the Nation of Islam. But then you can see his breakaway from the Nation of Islam because he saw Elijah Muhammad as having... I don't think so. I think everybody takes time, and unfortunately this isn't something that gets fixed overnight, so maybe it does take this many years.